Welcome to the Athletic FC podcast. I'm Adam Leventhal. Now, no matter where he's managing, Jose Mourinho simply cannot stay out of the headlines, and his time managing in the Turkish Super League has seen more of the same. So, is this typical Jose, or is he a victim of the chaos that surrounds him? Well, with me today, we have the Athletic's Rory Smith and Andy Mitten. Now, for people who haven't followed this particular story about Jose Mourinho, he's now the manager of Fenerbahce. He played rivals Galatasaray on February the 24th. It was a 0-0 draw, but so much happened as a result of the game. Mourinho was banned for 4 matches by the Turkish Football Federation, given a hefty fine for remarks about the fourth official and also for what Galatasaray alleged to be racist statements. Well, Fenerbahce said that Mourinho's comments were taken completely out of context and deliberately distorted, while Mourinho has filed a compensation lawsuit against Galatasaray due to an attack on his personal rights. And lastly, that initial suspension of 4 games has now been reduced to 2 on appeal. Now, Andy, we've got all that out of the way. You were actually at the game and you had a front row ticket for Jose Mourinho in action. Just take us into that moment if you can, first up.
Well, if you want atmosphere, Fenerbahce Galatasaray, or Galatasaray Fenerbahce, as I should say, because it was a home game Galatasaray, it's one of the best in the world. And it's one of the few big derby games that I've not been to. I've watched football in Turkey many times. I've always loved the atmosphere there. It's top 3 in the world. It is that good. And there are Man United players who will say the best atmosphere they ever played in front of was in Turkey, be it at Besiktas, Fenerbahce, Galatasaray. I was there along with 52,000 others, including 2,000 travelling Fenerbahce supporters. I was probably one of the few people not smoking, or so it seemed to me, when I was in the stadium, and just in front of me was the Galatasaray bench, which was animated throughout, and just to my right was the Fenerbahce bench. I was struck by how I didn't see Jose Mourinho until the game started. And I just thought, he's wisely waiting in the shadows here. He knows he's going to be centre of attention. I'd be stunned if he didn't become centre of attention. So where on earth is he? And then the game started, and then I just saw him. And right from the off, he was objecting to the animated Fenerbahce bench, Galatasaray bench, sorry. And then there were various moments of tension where decisions were disputed. At one point, the Galatasaray bench surged forward, and one of the people on it, I think it was a substitute, was giving it, hold me back now, and nobody did hold him back, and he just turned and went back to the bench. So I'm observing it all thinking, this is so theatrical and so exaggerated, and it was a 0-0 draw, so neither team won, but neither team lost as well. It helps Galatasaray, they've got a 6-point advantage. But Mourinho was brought in to make Fenerbahce champions again. They've got a huge wage bill, they've got lots of star players, and despite getting 99 points last season, they still couldn't win the Turkish Super League.
Yeah, and we'll get stuck into the dynamics in Turkish football over the course of this episode. But just briefly, Rory, if you can, because we'll go into this in a little bit more detail a little bit later on. But on the refereeing issue in Turkey, for that game in particular, Slovenian Slavko Vincic was in charge of the derby because both clubs had requested a foreign official. Just briefly explain how this decision was even thought about in the first place, let alone happening.
Yeah, briefly is tricky with the issue of referees in Turkey, but in this specific incident, you'd had a number of kind of allegations of favourable refereeing towards Galatasaray, others favourable refereeing towards Fenerbahce, and the whole thing had become so kind of swaddled in controversy and so toxic and so kind of such a flashpoint that both Galatasaray and Fenerbahce, I think initially as a kind of posturing move, said that they didn't trust any Turkish referee to take charge of the game, that they couldn't be sure that a Turkish referee would be impartial. And eventually, when both clubs filed petitions, the Turkish Football Federation, I think to an extent, called their bluff and said, OK, we'll get a foreigner to do it. And they went for Slavko Vincic, who is, I suppose, one of the more high-profile referees in Europe at the moment. I personally feel I could walk down the street and not recognise him, but maybe other people feel differently. Really big fans of referees. He did the Champions League final last year, so I guess if you're going to go and get a referee, a foreign referee, you might as well go and get the one who did the most high-profile game of 2024. And he was brought in, apparently, it was reported in Turkey, for a fee of €10,000 plus an €800 a day per DM, which seems relatively generous to me. Istanbul's not that expensive, along with 2 assistants. And the idea was that having a Slovenian, having a foreigner, first time in more than half a century that a foreign referee's taken charge of a Turkish league game, the idea was that would kind of circumvent the endless refereeing conspiracies that now appear in Turkish football with, even by the standards of Turkish football, alarming regularity.
Mourinho getting under people's skin, that's basically his thing, isn't it, Rory? It has been his thing for years and years and years. So he's not changed, and the environment in Turkey is almost perfect for him. Yeah,
I think I might have said at some point, and it's a little bit glib, and maybe I should regret it, that it's almost as though Turkish football is kind of where Mourinho naturally belongs. You know, we've seen for years and years and years that when players need to rehabilitate their reputation, or sometimes when they're looking for a final kind of payday at the end of their careers, they want to stay in a major footballing culture, but perhaps not one that's quite at the level of England or Italy or Spain or Germany. They will look to Turkey, where often wages can be high, tax can be quite low, and you see it almost as a kind of twilight thing. With Mourinho, it felt almost as though he's been building, like getting himself ready to manage one of Istanbul's big 3, like making sure he can cause enough trouble to really make the most of that position. I think with Mourinho, that the sensible interpretation is maybe that he needs someone to rage against. Mourinho, I think that's kind of where he draws his inspiration. If you think of someone like Guardiola is maybe trying to kind of live up to the ideals of Cruyff or institute his vision for perfect football, that's kind of his broader inspiration for getting up in the morning. With Mourinho, he kind of needs to prove someone wrong. He needs to prove that he is the underdog, the oppressed, the kind of the person who's trying to overturn the regime. I think the danger in Turkey is that he is in an environment that is already so charged, where the context is really different, even to, you know, English football and Italian football and Spanish football are all played out to a backdrop of ridiculous hype. But Turkey is another level. The tension in the air generally is a little bit more volatile. And I do wonder whether Mourinho in that environment, doing just reasonably regular like Mourinho stuff, the consequences are a little bit more severe.
Yeah, do you agree with that, Andy, having been there and seen it and how he's operating? Because, as Rory said, he's done some sort of more fun, trivial things, putting the laptop in front of the camera during a game to show the decision that had gone against his team, etc., etc. But do you get the feeling that he's very close to the line, or is he just playing that different role of, I'm going to prod them when I need to and when I want to?
Rory's right. He's in an environment which is more charged and less reasonable than the environments that he's working in front of. So both clubs agreed that a Slovenian referee would be a good thing. I spent the day with Galatasaray fans, and the hospitality there, I've got to say, is fantastic. And they were suspicious that the Slovenian referee somehow had a link to Fenerbahce. And I have no doubt that if I spoke to Fenerbahce fans, they would tell me exactly the same the other way round. And the length that these conspiracies went to, I just started laughing. And I'm meeting people who are literally saying, I don't use that airline because it's owned by a Galatasaray supporter. I only use this hire car company because they sponsor Galatasaray shirts, even though it's more expensive. I met a lady who lives in London, has a very good job, a very sensible, well-educated lady, who said to me, I'm single, but I refuse to date Fenerbahce supporters. And my mother said, this is ridiculous. You need to grow up. You need to widen the pool. And she said, I will not compromise here. This was an intelligent person. And I said, you know, I'd like to put that in my article. She said, fine, I'd be really proud. And when it was published, she's like, why did you put my second name? I'm completely proud about this. I'm like, well, okay, that's fine. So this is the environment. Now, Galatasaray have got a better team than Fenerbahce. So Mourinho has got to use everything he can. Galatasaray have been the preeminent force. Fenerbahce have got all the star names. They have been effective. More effective in Europe. So going into that game, Galatasaray had just been knocked out of the Europa League just a few days before. Fenerbahce had progressed. Besiktas had gone out a few weeks earlier. So they're your big three in Turkey. And even then, that wasn't straightforward, because I'd meet Galatasaray fans who were uncertain about their very successful coach because they didn't think he takes European football seriously. Or the more sensible ones would say, we don't have a squad for European football as well. We have to prioritise winning the Turkish league. Whereas Fenerbahce fans were gloating because they've gone further this year in European football than any other Turkish thing. Nothing at all seems to be at face value. And it's very interesting to the other derbies in the world, because it isn't based on class or religion or geography. Anyone can be anyone. And often when I write about derbies, I would say, I had to support this team because my father or my mother said. You don't get that in Istanbul. It's literally a free-for-all. And what attaches fans to their club, I've not seen that anywhere else in the world. And it's a wonderful football culture there. The passion is one of the best three in the world in terms of the atmosphere. The stadiums have all been modernised. Turkish companies, well, one of them's building Camp Nou. They have excelled to the point that even Adanaspor, who visited Galatasaray a few weeks earlier, that controversial game where the team went off, they're playing in wonderful, wonderful stadiums with 30 or 40,000 capacities. But in terms of the stature of the club, it falls away very quickly. You've got Galatasaray average 48,000, Fenerbahce 42, Besiktas 35. Then you've got Trabzonspor, and then it falls right down. And the league average is only 12,000. So I saw a game between Besiktas and Eyüpspor, and I'd just like to confirm
Yorkshire's
exactly.
national team.
Why didn't I realise that when I was at Eyüpspor? They weren't founded in Burnley. They were founded in Istanbul. They're managed by Arda Turan. I went to see him as well. And there were only 3,000 people there. So for this football-mad country, there are also little idiosyncrasies as well.
And it's interesting with Jose Mourinho. We saw that in his first unveiling, didn't we? That he was really playing up to the crowd, and you thought, yeah, he's at home here. And it goes back to the Mourinho that we were first introduced to in England when he took over at Chelsea, even though we'd seen a glimpse of his sort of antics at Porto before. Rory, do you think now he's in Turkey, he's still able to operate in the way that he would like in press conferences, which he uses in whatever way he wants?
I think he is himself, isn't he? Jose Mourinho isn't able to change. There is no. He's had various points in his career where he's sort of tried to play the elder statesman, and it lasts for a couple of weeks, and then he can't quite resist. And that's kind of Mourinho. It is part of his charm. It's, as Andy says, it's kind of part of his arsenal. It's something that he has previously weaponized to great effect, and he is really good at creating those kind of siege mentalities. He can be cheeky and charming when he wants to be. He can be aggravating and provocative when he wants to be as well. He's often deeply unreasonable. He's sometimes quite funny. He is kind of, that's his character, and that's what he brings. I think it maybe loses its charm a little bit as he gets older, when he's not the, you've got to remember that when he went in at Chelsea, he was the young thrusting usurper of the old order, wasn't he? He was the outsider. He had to kind of convey that impression of himself to kind of establish his credentials going up against Sir Alex Ferguson and Arsene Wenger and these kind of great figures of coaching. He wanted to project himself as, I am young and I'm exciting and I'm the new thing on the new kid on the block. Now that he's kind of in his 60s, there is part of me that thinks, all right, maybe you need to kind of wind this in a little bit now. It's kind of an old shtick. But the crucial thing in Turkey is, and Andy's mentioned this as well, it plays differently. It's really, really fine in England to kind of toy with that idea of conspiracy, to suggest that some dark force is acting against you, because as ridiculous as English football culture has become, it is still grounded to some extent in reason, as much as people won't necessarily believe it. There are reasonable voices out there. There are reasonable opinions to be had. There's almost, this sounds a bit kind of overblown, but there's like a shared reality that we operate in. It's the same in Spain-ish. It depends how much Real Madrid TV you watch, but it's still basically the same in Spain, certainly the same in Germany, even in Italy, where there is, happy talk of conspiracy all the time. It doesn't go to a certain level. In Turkey, the context is completely different, and I don't know whether Mourinho would necessarily have been advised this way, but I suspect someone should probably have told him, you might have to tone this down, because what you say will carry and echo much further in Turkey than it does elsewhere.
Currently, Mourinho's Fenerbahce are 4 points back from the leaders Galatasaray, so it's a close race. In terms of the European side of things, squeaked through. They play Rangers in the last 16 of the Europa League. And then intriguingly, and I think secretly everyone would love all of this to fall into place, they could face his last three clubs in management: Roma in the quarterfinals, Manchester United in the semi-finals, and Spurs in the final. Andy, I mean, are people already talking about that? Do you sense that he's sort of privately talking about that as well? What a dream scenario that may well be.
Yeah, the big issue there is Manchester United are not very good, so the idea of them getting through to play these games isn't quite as realistic as it may have been. Mourinho's always been very complimentary about his former clubs when he's moved on, and he said that getting Manchester United to second in the Premier League was his greatest achievement in management, and I'm not sure I fully believe that, but I went to see Ole Gunnar Solskjaer when I was in Istanbul, and that's something that he picked up on as well. Solskjaer's been very clever, or maybe he's just been himself, by staying out of this whole Fenerbahce Galatasaray thing. People are trying to pull him into it all the time, every single day. And even me as an outside journalist, because one thing I've found about Turkish football fans, they really value what people outside Turkey think of them. Perception is really important. And even people, journalists, seeing me talking to Solskjaer meant that I started getting a lot of messages in the following days. Could you confirm that Solskjaer is not going back to Man United? Well, no, I can't, because, I mean, where's this come from? He's just arrived here. So it's this environment sped up. Graham Souness said to me last year about Istanbul, which he still visits once a year, and he's a big hero to Galatasaray fans because he planted the Galatasaray flag in the middle of Fenerbahce's centre circle. He described it as London on steroids. And there is this incredible energy, and it's the biggest city in Europe in terms of population. Certainly got the biggest traffic jams as well. It is a fantastic place. And Solskjaer was really drawn towards that. He said, I want to live there. I want to manage there. It's probably the opposite of where he's been for the last 3 years, in a sleepy provincial Norwegian town. And of course they pay well. And of course the tax regime is favourable if you come in outside of the country as well. But they can offer top European football, incredible atmosphere, big stadiums, big city living, big rivalries. There are lots of pluses to Turkish football as well.
And Rory, you mentioned, where being manager of Fenerbahce fits into the arc of Jose Mourinho's career in comparison with where managing Besiktas now is for Ole Gunnar Solskjaer. Do you think it could be restorative? Do you think he would ever be considered as a Premier League manager? Again, it may not be his target. He probably wouldn't want to manage anyone else in the Premier League apart from Manchester United. But where do you think it fits in for his career?
Well, there might be a job at Man United coming up relatively soon.
He could just go back.
Well, to be fair, I think this is kind of tangential, but I think what Solskjaer did at United is probably being made to look quite a lot better by what's happened since, to be perfectly honest. Yeah. That it's becoming increasingly clear that we shouldn't really judge the people who have, in inverted commas, failed at Manchester United as kind of the source of the failure, the cause of the problems, when it looks like they are so evidently systemic. I think for Mourinho, Fenerbahce is I don't want to say it's a final payday, but it's a stop as his career declines. I think that's abundantly obvious. I know he said that he's keen to come back to the Premier League. I'm not quite sure I see where that might happen. He'd probably have to drop his expectations in terms of competing and stuff fairly far to get back to England. For Solskjaer, I think Besiktas is a way to. He doesn't necessarily need to rehabilitate his reputation, but maybe to get himself back on that track. That, as Andy says, Besiktas is a huge club. It's a huge kind of European force. They will expect to play European football, maybe not Champions League immediately, but Europa League, Conference League certainly next season. They They expect to compete for honours in Turkey, even if Andy says sort of financially, economically, they're very much the third wheel. It's a way for him to get a high-profile, high-pressure job and prove he can make a success of it. And it may well be that, I mean, we kind of have to say, he might want to stay at Besiktas for 10 years. No one's managing a Turkish club for 10 years. That's not the point of Turkish football. But it may well be that he sees himself there for a couple of years, 2 or 3 years, which would be a really good stint in Istanbul for anyone. And then it might be that Germany or Spain or France or Italy or, perhaps England comes back into view. I think Solskjaer will feel, Andy knows him much better than I do, I suspect Solskjaer will feel he's got more to give in the big 5 leagues of Western Europe. Doing well at Besiktas is a really good way to say to potential employers, I can cope with this pressure, I can cope with these expectations, and given this is mad to say this of a team in Istanbul, a more kind of smoothly run team than Manchester United, I can do really good work. And that's what Besiktas is probably one of the few clubs in Europe where you can reasonably say, if I can cope with the pressure here, I can cope with the pressure pretty much anywhere. And I think that's probably a fair thing to assume, that if you can deal with Besiktas, with any of those Turkish teams, you can deal with pretty much anything.
You're right, Rory, in everything you say there. Solskjaer is a great people's person. Players really respond to them. He gets them smiling. There was a lot of criticism towards the end of his time at Manchester United that somehow he was tactically anemic. So one thing he did, he got a job as UEFA Technical Observer. He went deep into tactics. He'd chide me saying, what do you know about tactics? And I'm like, well, I've not got a UEFA A licence like you, but this and that. And he'd wind me up about it. So there's a good side to his personality as well. Incredibly loyal. Refused the Mouldy job in December out of respect to his former assistant who'd lost his job. That former assistant is now his assistant in Turkey. So that's someone who's managed Mulder in European football. So as soon as Besiktas fans saw the standard of people going in there, they were like, okay, this is interesting. And Ollie knows some coaches who, they hate the media side of everything, but he's quite comfortable with it all. And on Friday night, I saw him complimenting the ground staff of the opposition for getting a game on during snowbound conditions in Istanbul, which is pretty rare. And I thought, that's a really simple thing to do, but it just shows his appreciation. And you could see the Turkish journalist really warming to that. And he is just being himself. But Rory's absolutely right. He still feels he's got a lot to offer. He does speak German. That was a country which interested him, although he turned a couple of jobs down in Germany. There was a point in March of last year where he was being linked to Bayern Munich. And he said to me, where's this coming from? I said, I don't know. He said, well, you're not much of a journalist if you don't know. I said, well, it's not coming out of England. And I did a bit of digging, and it was coming out of Munich. I said, my advice to you is say absolutely nothing, because that is like me being linked to Elizabeth Early. Let people say that all day long. He's like, well, what do you mean? I said, well, if you got the Bayern job, I don't think Bayern fans would be delighted that you've become their new manager. This is your level. But if in a few months' time you got another job in the Bundesliga, their fans might say, well, he was linked to Bayern Munich, he must be good. So it's the optics of it all. And he didn't say anything, and he carried on turning jobs down. I know that Spain has always been attractive to him, but I also know he doesn't speak Spanish. I find it quite interesting that Hansi Flick's gone into Barcelona, communicates entirely in English. So that's another thing, the Anglification and English language being even more prevalent in dressing rooms around the world. So Solskjaer is speaking to his players in English, and of course there are Turkish translators there as well. But this is becoming more normalised in leagues well away from England. He's still ambitious. He was burned a little bit by the Man United experience in the end, but it was only that last 6 weeks. And even in the interview we did for The Athletic, he referred to Man United as we. And I said, we? He said, we. I'm like, okay, you've just about ruled out ever managing Manchester City and Liverpool then. And he was quite comfortable with that.
Right, time now to hear from Turkish journalist Engin Kahali, who works for outlet TRT Sport. And we asked Engin about Turkish football's contentious and complex relationship with refereeing, which Jose Mourinho, of course, has been very vocal about.
I think it has always been an issue, but in the last 10 years, the conversations about the referees, the power of the club presidents to change the refereeing committees has been a major issue in Turkish football. From 2000 to 2025, there have been 22 different refereeing committees. And if you change something that often, it's not easy to find a sustainable and successful infrastructure or any kind of system. This year, with Jose Mourinho and Acun Ilıcalı, one of the main topics has been the performance of refereeing on the pitch, which had a valid basis, I think, these conversations. But at the same time, with that pressure, it's not easy to perform on the pitch. So the last derby has been refereed by Vincic. I think he refereed a good game, but whatever they do, with every call has been criticized that much, with the influence of social media in Turkish football now, and after every call, there have been numerous clips on the social media criticizing the referee, whoever it is. So that affected the club managements to vocally say the mistakes of the referees. I think it's not an easy situation for anyone. I mean, not the referees, not the presidents, not the players, but with that kind of tension and with that kind of rapid change on the refereeing committee, it's not easy to find balance. So I think it will take some time for the Turkish audience to start believing and trusting the refereeing system again. And I'm not pretty sure how this transition will start or how long it will take.
Yeah, thanks very much to Engin for his take on this. Rory, do you feel that it's broken? Is it irreparable? Especially when, conspiracies are ruling a lot of parts of the world.
Yeah, it's really hard not to see the echoes. It always sounds so kind of pretentious, and it feels like a bit of a stretch even as you do it when you say that kind of football has this remarkable habit, not just to reflect the world, but almost to foreshadow it. And it feels like you're kind of a sports journalist trying to be more important than you are, to be honest. But it happens all the time. And yeah, it's really hard not to feel that the stuff we see playing out in US politics at the moment, in British politics, in global politics that affect, wars and actual kind of significant human events, that you do see little shadows of them in football. And quite often football was there first, to be perfectly honest. And in Turkey in particular, there is a culture of conspiracy. I went to Istanbul a little bit longer ago than Andy did for the New York Times. And I think I must have done late 2019, early 2020. It was just before the pandemic. And I met Arda Turan, as Andy did. This was before he was a manager. I had a lovely breakfast with Arda Turan. I can recommend having breakfast with Arda Turan overlooking the Bosphorus as a life experience that everyone should have at least once. But also I spoke to dozens of people who work in clubs, who own clubs, who run teams, about the culture of conspiracy that had taken hold in Turkish football. And this was 5 years ago. And it was a real problem then. And I remember club owners of minor teams, and as Andy said earlier, these are often quite small teams. They're not massive stadiums. They're not massive fan bases. Turkey is dominated by those big three Istanbul clubs and to an extent Trabzonspor. And they said that the basic issue is that nobody has any faith in the legitimacy of the decisions. They don't believe that the results are real because they believe the referees are compromised.
You have club owners, club presidents who are huge personalities. So I struggle to hear a Galatasaray song which wasn't about Fenerbahce's president, Ali Koç. So he's one of Turkey's wealthiest and most influential people and has a lot of control in the media. So that leads to even more suspicion from Galatasaray fans. And I quite innocently fancied putting a sample of the atmosphere out there on social media and said to my host, is this not offensive? No, this is very offensive. Okay, what about this one? No, this is also very offensive as well. Okay, what about this one? No, this is also very offensive as well. And I literally didn't end up putting a song out there to showcase the incredible atmosphere. And also as a journalist, I was well aware that if I put anything out, I would be accused of siding with the others because, and I thought that's not my intention either. So I went to see Arda Turan, and Rory's right, he's a real character and he's a fantastic player. Very interesting to interview. Very much an acolyte of the Diego Simeone, Luis Enrique school of management. Very passionate figure. And his club is owned by another very influential, very wealthy person. And yet everybody in Turkey knows that Arda Turan is Galatasaray because he was such a key player there. He was a ball boy there when he was a kid, even at the old Ali Sami Yen Stadium. And he doesn't hide this. And why should he hide it? And everybody expects him at some point to become the coach of Galatasaray. And that's spoken openly even at the club he's managing at, who were fourth in the league. They were third until Besiktas beat them away. So there's very much a pecking order, and everyone's pretty comfortable of where your club is in this pecking order, apart from Galatasaray and Fenerbahce supporters.
Is it what Andy says about the national scale is really important. So especially of those three Istanbul teams, they are obviously the Turkish clubs. You have democratically elected presidents, which I think most of us feel is an admirable model. There's certainly plenty of people who might think it works better than selling your clubs to nation states in England. The problem with it is it turns those into positions of national significance, especially in Turkey. It's minimised to an extent in Spain and Germany, but in Turkey, if you are president of Fenerbahce, of Galatasaray, of Besiktas, that is effectively a national position akin to being a politician, akin to being mayor of Istanbul. You'll probably have more power as president of Galatasaray than being mayor of Istanbul, and being mayor of Istanbul is a major thing. That means that the presidents use the clubs to further their own agendas. And obviously, if people who are seeking power, perhaps broader like civic power, are finding things a little tough as president of a football team, and that happens, it's quite difficult running a successful football team. They tend to resort, I guess, to what you might call politicians' tricks, which means you do invoke conspiracy. You suggest that things have been arranged. You suggest that your opponents are malevolent and kind of evil in some way. You maybe allow yourself to think about darker thoughts than you would if you were purely involved in a sporting exercise. And I think the issue is that that's now happened not just at those big three Turkish clubs, but at all the Turkish clubs. You have some that are obviously politicised. Istanbul Başakşehir here, who became kind of a European force out of nowhere. There is a long-standing and probably quite reasonable theory that they received a degree of political support from the PKK, Erdogan's party, the dominant force in Turkish politics. There are others in local areas in Izmir or in Adana Demirspor. All these clubs that have come up will have kind of attracted local political support as well. And I remember a friend of mine, Caner Eller, who's the editor of Socrates, which is a brilliant Turkish football magazine, said to me when I was there, this was a few years ago, I'm sure he would stand by the quote, that the basic problem with Turkish football is that everybody knows the names of all the club presidents. And it's because they use them to grandstand, they use them as platforms, as microphones, as megaphones to get their views across. And when things don't go the way they like, the presidents don't say, do you know what, we spent the money badly, we'll try and do better. They say, someone is fixing this against us.
Just a last point on this from both of you. I suppose in England, we got a taste of what it's like more frequently in Turkey when we had the situation with Nottingham Forest complaining about referees, and that felt very strange in England, and it led to punishments and admonishment from the Premier League, from authorities, from everyone who wanted to say, hang on a minute, you can't be speaking like this. Do you ever feel, Rory and Andy, that the situation in England will ever end up like it is in Turkey, or is it something that is going to be their problem rather than a problem in the Premier League? Rory, let's start with you.
I think that it's really easy for us to other Turkish football, and you see it a lot, and I'm sure I've been guilty of it at times as well, that you look at Turkey and you orientalise it. You think, well, it's Turkey, it's exotic, it's a bit different. Obviously it is part of Europe, but it's also kind of separate from Europe. It's obviously it's a secular country, but it's an Islamic country. It's kind of spices, and it's the Hagia Sophia, and it's markets, and it's kind of, there's a temptation to look at Turkey and think they're different. They're not. I mean, obviously they are different countries, and people are different all over the world. But there is no reason to believe that they are more susceptible to conspiratorial thinking than we are. And the piece I wrote last week, which took in what happened with Slavko Vincic and the Intercontinental Derby, it's not, I think, a coincidence that has happened in the same season that Real Madrid have launched probably the most improbable war on refereeing and establishment conspiracy that there has ever been, and that Pablo Longoria, the president of Marseille, has been banned for 15 games for alleging that French football is corrupt and that the referees are rigged against Marseille. AC Milan have kind of implied something a little bit softer, but they've done the same thing. They've kind of said we need to speak to the referees about there being more respect for Milan as a club and Milan's players. There's a lot of clubs around Europe, including England, who are kind of like fiddling around with this stuff a little bit. They're maybe not playing the full song yet, but they're working out what the chords are. We're seeing it more and more that everyone is happy to allege conspiracy, and I'm not sure that we should see Turkey as an outlier, as an exception. I think we should probably look at Turkey and think they're just further down the road than we are. They got there first, because the problem with using that as a way to excuse your own failures, as a way to vent your own frustration, is that after a while, your fans and the fans of other clubs start to believe it. And if we believe that football is just one giant conspiracy, that everything is rigged against us, then we have a problem, not just with the perception of integrity, but the perception of kind of the reality of the league. You get people not believing the results. And once you don't believe in the results of football, which we should all remember at all times, is an entirely voluntary activity, it's a leisure activity, we don't have to be interested in it, it's not compulsory, then people start querying what the point of being involved is. And that is really genuinely dangerous.
I think one of the reasons the Premier League is so popular internationally is because it's trusted. It seemed to be clean. There's a respect for it where results are trusted, rightly or wrongly. So when a club like Nottingham Forest comes out openly and protests against referees, it's really rare, because it's routine in some of the countries which Rory has mentioned, and it might be more of a southern Mediterranean thing. It's absolutely normal in Turkey. If you speak to fans, it's completely normal wherever you are. There are fans of every single football club who think the world is against them, not just in referees, but in terms of the media. I remember writing for the Manchester Evening News where Manchester City fans were convinced it was a red-leaning paper, and Manchester United fans were convinced that it was a blue-leaning paper. Now, they both can't be right. The two things cannot be true, but this is the psyche of football fans. And if Souness says Istanbul is London on steroids, then the football culture there is an exaggeration of what fans might think. And a lot of these presidents, they are fans themselves. They're very passionate. So some of the positives we take from Turkish football, such as the passion, which is a bit crazy at times, and it would probably give a health and safety inspector nightmares in England, to the point that the Premier League, it is a bit sanitised now, and the atmosphere is not as good as it was, and you better sit down there because you've just been stood up for 10 seconds. Some of the attractions that we find in Turkish football or Southern European football, they can also be negatives, because people say things that can lead ultimately to foreign referees being drafted in for your biggest game of the season. Even then, they couldn't escape the conspiracies.
Andy, Rory, Engin earlier on, thank you very much indeed. Thanks very much for watching on YouTube. Don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. You can leave us comments below with your thoughts too on conspiracies if you wish. That's all for now. IO will be back tomorrow.
If you want to watch more episodes of the show, please subscribe to the channel. We'll be joined by the likes of David Ornstein, Matt Slater, Adam Crafton, Carl Anker, and plenty more through the season. If you'd like to listen to the episodes in full in audio form, search The Athletic FC wherever you get your podcasts from.